The village of St. Mary Mead was draped in the soft glow of early December, the frost-laced hedgerows twinkling under the pale morning sun. Smoke rose from chimneys like gentle reminders of hearths and home, while the scent of baking mingled with the crisp winter air. At the heart of the village, the old vicarage had been transformed for the annual Christmas tea, a tradition as fixed as the church bells chime. Tables groaned under silver trays of mince pies and plum cakes, crystal bowls of sugared almonds, and steaming pots of tea. Miss Marple, seated near the edge of the drawing-room, sipped her tea quietly, her sharp eyes observing everything, or rather, everyone, without drawing attention to herself. The gathering was a familiar mix. Lady Agatha Redfern, resplendent in emerald velvet, the newly appointed vicar, Reverend Clement Hargreaves, nervously adjusting his collar, the gossipy Mrs. Pettigrew, always eager to recount a story that may or may not be true, and young Henry Barton, who had the restless energy of someone perpetually awaiting mischief. The chatter was amiable, filled with polite laughter and the occasional jingle of spoons against china. Yet beneath the holiday cheer, Miss Marple detected subtle tensions. The stiff bow Lady Agatha gave to the vicar, the nervous fidgeting of Mrs. Pettigrew, and Henry's almost imperceptible glances toward the kitchen door. It was, of course, the perfect setting for a murder. And, as if the universe were inclined to obey her unspoken expectation, the sharp, urgent scream shattered the room's calm. The sound came from the far end of the hallway, where the kitchen staff hurried about their duties. Guests froze mid-sentence, teacups trembling in their hands. Lady Agatha's lips parted in horror. Good heavens! What on earth? Miss Marple, unperturbed by the sudden panic, set her cup down with meticulous care. She rose and walked at a measured pace toward the source of the commotion, her eyes sweeping the faces of each guest, noting how they reacted. The slight paling of skin, the hands gripping armrests, the involuntary shuffles backward. The kitchen doorway framed a scene that none present would soon forget. Mr. Thomas Albright, the village baker, lay sprawled across the polished floor, a deep crimson spreading across his chest. The knife he had been carrying, presumably for slicing a Christmas ham, rested a mere foot away from his still hand. "Call the police," cried Mrs. Pettigrew, her voice breaking under the weight of her own hysteria. "Sit down, everyone," Miss Marple said calmly, her voice carrying the soft authority of one accustomed to order in the face of chaos. "And do not touch anything. Let us not disturb the scene before help arrives." Reverend Hargreaves hurried to the telephone, while the rest of the villagers exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered, others gasped, and a few, like young Henry, seemed almost fascinated, as if the tragedy were a puzzle waiting to be solved. Miss Marple's eyes, however, lingered not on the body alone, but on the surroundings. A faint trail of flour led toward the back pantry. The knife was wiped clean in one hand, while the other bore a faint smudge of powdered sugar. The smallest details, the crooked chair, the half-open spice cabinet, spoke to her more than the obvious horror. She made a mental note of everything, aware that these minor observations were often more telling than any declaration of guilt shouted in panic. As the village held its collective breath, Miss Marple felt that familiar stir of anticipation. There was much to unravel in St. Mary Mead tonight, and she would uncover it all, one small, quiet observation at a time. For now, however, she allowed the room to settle into stunned silence, letting the panic wash over the others while she silently began to weave the first threads of understanding. In her mind, the Christmas tea had just begun, and it would end with revelations that no one saw coming. By the time Inspector Crayford arrived, the vicarage had transformed from a scene of festive warmth into one of hushed tension. Villagers clustered in small groups, murmuring in anxious undertones, while the aroma of tea and mince pies lingered incongruously in the air. Miss Marple, seated calmly in a corner, observed the flurry without haste. She had learned long ago that the first reactions of people often revealed more than their words. Mrs. Pettigrew was the first to approach the inspector, her hat askew, clutching a handkerchief that trembled with indignation and fear. "Inspector, such a dreadful thing. Never in all my years have I seen anything like it. Mr. Albright, he was so good to everyone. But do you know what they say? Every man has enemies?" She paused dramatically, eyes darting toward Henry Barton, who seemed only half aware that a man lay dead, mere steps away. "Quiet, Mrs. Pettigrew," Miss Marple said softly, her tone gentle yet unmistakably firm. "Let him speak." Inspector Crayford, a middle-aged man with a meticulous manner, nodded politely, though his expression betrayed impatience. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll require statements from everyone here. I imagine the first question is obvious. Who last saw Mr. Albright alive?" The room erupted into a chorus of voices, each trying to assert their version of events. Lady Agatha Redfern claimed she had been arranging flowers in the hall and heard nothing but the clatter of trays, though her lips pressed into a thin line suggested otherwise. Reverend Hargreaves insisted he had been on the telephone with the parish office, organizing last-minute Christmas deliveries. Young Henry Barton, still leaning against the wall, shrugged. "I was getting a glass of water. Didn't see a thing. Except, well," his voice trailed off, leaving a tantalizing uncertainty in the air. Miss Marple noted each story with care, observing the subtle tells, Lady Agatha's rigid posture, as though she were forcing calm over alarm, the vicar's nervous adjustment of his sleeve, and Henry's restless glances, which seemed far too deliberate to be mere youthfulness. "What do you mean, Henry?" asked the inspector, raising an eyebrow. Henry hesitated, then nodded toward the kitchen. I saw someone running out of the kitchen just before it happened. Didn't get a proper look, though. It was quick. Shadows, mostly." Crayford scribbled in his notebook, and a low murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Pettigrew's eyebrows rose, and she muttered, "Shadows. It must be the new maid. I always suspected she wasn't entirely trustworthy." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, though she said nothing. She had already taken note of the small flour smudge near the knife, and the unusual arrangement of the spice jars. Human behavior, she knew, often betrayed secrets more reliably than any physical evidence alone. The villagers began to whisper among themselves, each theory more elaborate than the last. Some suggested jealousy over Albright's prized Christmas cakes. Others hinted at imagined slights in business dealings. Lady Agatha leaned toward Mrs. Pettigrew, whispering her suspicion of Henry's inattentiveness as potentially dangerous. Henry, in turn, grinned faintly, as if amused by their suspicions rather than threatened. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's attention drifted to less obvious details. The faint scuff marks near the pantry door, the slightly ajar cupboard beneath the sink, and the way the knife lay unnaturally straight on the floor, rather than near the body as one might expect in a panicked fall. Each small observation added another layer to the puzzle forming in her mind. A faint sound of sobbing broke her reverie. She turned to see Mrs. Doreen Langley, a quiet widow, holding herself with trembling restraint. I can't believe it. Poor Thomas. He was always so kind, always had a word for everyone. Why would anyone— Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple moved closer, placing a comforting hand on the widow's arm. "We'll find out, my dear. All will be revealed in time. For now, we must let the inspector do his work." Outside the vicarage, the village itself seemed to sense the disturbance. News traveled faster than the winter wind. Neighbors peered from windows, and local shopkeepers whispered in the shadows of their doorways. Rumors already twisted through the frosty streets, each retelling more sensational than the last. By late afternoon, it was widely believed that Mr. Albright had been murdered over a long-standing feud, though between whom, no one could say with certainty. At the vicarage, the inspector moved from guest to guest, recording statements with meticulous precision. Miss Marple allowed him the stage, her mind quietly piecing together the subtle inconsistencies. The first suspect seemed obvious: young Henry, the boy who had lingered near the scene and whose behavior was far too casual. Yet she noticed the small but telling contradictions in everyone else's accounts. The tilt of Lady Agatha's head when questioned, the vicar's insistence on the telephone alibi, and the way Mrs. Pettigrew consistently positioned herself near the front door, as if guarding or concealing something. After a while, Crayford paused, glancing at Miss Marple. "I imagine you have your own theories, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were serious. "Perhaps, Inspector, but one must never rush. In St. Mary Mead, everyone has a story, and sometimes the quietest voice speaks the loudest truths." The inspector nodded, acknowledging her point without further comment. He continued his questioning, unaware that Miss Marple had already begun constructing the invisible threads connecting motive, opportunity, and character. As evening approached, the tea remained cold, abandoned in saucers on tables, now scattered with evidence of interrupted festivity. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards, casting angular patterns over the faces of the villagers. Some were pale with fear, others with anticipation, and a few with the faintest hint of guilt or regret. Miss Marple, ever composed, sipped her tea at last. Her eyes wandered over the room one final time that day, noting the tiny details others overlooked. A faint smudge on the vicar's sleeve, the subtle tension in Lady Agatha's fingers, and the nervous twitch of Mrs. Pettigrew's jaw. Each told a story far richer than any words spoken aloud. "Yes," she murmured to herself, almost inaudibly, "there is more to this than meets the eye, and the threads will unravel, one by one, in time." Outside, the wind carried the distant bells of St. Mary Mead's church. Inside, a village cloaked in holiday cheer masked a growing fear that a murderer walked among them, quiet, unseen, and perhaps smiling. And Miss Marple, seated calmly in her corner, waited, observing, listening, understanding, knowing that patience would reveal what panic could not. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke beneath a delicate frost, the village streets glinting like sugar crystals in the weak winter sun. Yet the beauty of the season did little to warm hearts troubled by the night's tragedy. Mr. Thomas Albright's death hung over the village like a pall, coloring conversations with suspicion and unease. Miss Marple, as was her custom, began her day with quiet observation. The vicarage remained closed to the public, cordoned off by the local constable. Villagers still gathered in small clusters near the edge of the property, exchanging hurried whispers about who might have committed such a heinous act. Miss Marple strolled along the frost-lined lanes, greeting familiar faces with her usual gentle smile, though her mind was anything but idle. She paused at the baker's shop, which now seemed oddly hollow, its front windows clouded with grief rather than flour dust. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mary, the baker's assistant, eyes red from tears. "It's all so dreadful. I still can't believe it happened right here, in our peaceful village." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze flicking to the small flour streaks on Mary's apron. "Tell me, Mary, did Thomas seem worried about anything yesterday? Or was he his usual cheerful self?" Mary hesitated, wringing her hands. He did mention a disagreement with someone over the Christmas supplies, but he laughed it off, said it was nothing. I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Small tensions often disguise the largest grievances. "Thank you, dear. You've been very helpful," she continued on, her mind quietly cataloguing every piece of information, no matter how trivial it seemed. Returning to the vicarage, she observed the arrival of Inspector Crayford and his assistant, notebook in hand. They began their methodical inspection, taking careful notes and photographing the scene, though Miss Marple noticed with quiet amusement that they seemed to focus almost exclusively on the physical evidence. Flour smudges, scuff marks, and a slightly ajar pantry door, the things that had caught her attention, elicited only passing glances from them. Inside, the remaining villagers gathered in the drawing room under Crayford's questioning. Each was asked to recount their actions during the Christmas tea, and Miss Marple listened attentively, her mind mapping out contradictions, hesitations, and the subtle cues of guilt or concealment. Lady Agatha Redfern, ever proud and composed, recounted that she had been arranging flowers and ensuring the vicar's guests were comfortable. Her story was precise, almost rehearsed, yet her hands fidgeted beneath her muff, betraying a nervous energy. Miss Marple made a mental note. People who overcompensated with order often hid a deeper agitation. Reverend Hargreaves, still flushed from the previous day's alarm, insisted that he had been occupied with last-minute calls and preparations for the church's Christmas Eve service. His voice wavered slightly, and he avoided meeting anyone's gaze for too long, particularly Miss Marple's. Henry Barton, the boy whose previous afternoon's shadow sighting had stirred curiosity, now fidgeted at the edge of the group, casting occasional glances toward the kitchen door. Miss Marple observed the way he tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, an unconscious rhythm betraying impatience, anxiety, or perhaps an attempt to mask nervousness. Mrs. Pettigrew, predictably, whispered numerous conjectures, some entirely fantastical, about motives ranging from jealousy to revenge. "I wouldn't put it past anyone," she exclaimed. "The village has more secrets than anyone imagines." Miss Marple merely nodded. Secrets, indeed, they often revealed themselves in the most ordinary behaviors. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple ventured into the kitchen under the pretense of offering the vicarage staff tea and a kind word. She examined the scene carefully. The pantry door was still slightly ajar. The knife lay in the same place as yesterday, and a faint trace of powdered sugar had collected near the floorboards. More importantly, she noted the direction of the scuff marks, evidence perhaps of hurried movement toward the back door. She crouched slightly, peering at the marks, and a tiny insight occurred to her. The perpetrator had not fled directly from the body. Instead, they had moved in a particular pattern, seemingly attempting to mislead anyone who might observe the crime scene. Only someone familiar with the kitchen's layout could maneuver in such a manner without hesitation. Later, as Miss Marple joined the villagers in the drawing room once more, she observed the subtle shifts in conversation. Gossip was never reliable, but behavior often was. Lady Agatha frequently glanced toward the vicar, who shifted uneasily in his chair. Mrs. Pettigrew fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, wringing it repeatedly, while Henry's foot tapped a restless rhythm. Each movement, each glance, and each hesitation spoke volumes to her trained eye. She found herself drawn to a seemingly inconsequential remark made by the vicar. "Thomas was a dear man," he said quietly. "He did not deserve." He trailed off, his voice catching. The pause was fleeting but telling. Miss Marple filed the subtle inflection away, noting that even the kindest words could hide unease or conceal guilt. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Crayford had compiled an initial report, but had drawn no conclusions. He focused on what was obvious: the knife, the location of the body, and the possibility of an intruder. Miss Marple, however, understood that the truth would lie not in the physical evidence, but in the relationships, resentments, and long-hidden grievances that simmered beneath the village's polite exterior. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the day in quiet observation. She watched the villagers interact with one another, noting patterns, pauses, and tiny gestures. A nod here, a flinch there, a hesitation in speech. Each was a clue, invisible to the untrained eye, but crucial to understanding the full picture. By evening, she returned to her small room, her mind alive with connections. Flower smudges, scuff marks, and misplaced objects. These were details others dismissed, yet they were threads in the fabric of the mystery, and human behavior, she reminded herself, was often the loudest signal in the absence of overt evidence. As she prepared for bed, she penned a few quiet notes, organizing her thoughts. Lady Agatha's nervous composure, the vicar's evasive manner, Henry's calculated indifference, and Mrs. Pettigrew's exaggerated theatrics, each was a piece of a puzzle that, though incomplete, was beginning to form a pattern. Outside, snow began to fall, light and silent, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a deceptive serenity. Within the vicarage, however, a storm of human emotion, hidden motives, and subtle deceit had taken hold, and Miss Marple, patient and unassuming, was already unraveling the threads that no one else had noticed. The village had reacted, the gossip had spread, and the police had begun their investigation. But the real work, the careful reading of human nature, had only just begun. By the following morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had grown thick with unease. The Christmas tea had passed into village history, but its shadow lingered over every doorstep, every shop, and every conversation. Inspector Crayford had begun formal interviews, and the first theory had already taken root. Someone known to Mr. Albright had killed him, not an outsider. The villagers, naturally, had opinions, and they were eager to share them. Mrs. Pettigrew, who prided herself on her insight into human affairs, was particularly vocal. "It must have been Henry Barton," she declared, addressing anyone who would listen. "He was always lurking about, a mischievous boy, and you saw how he ran when the scream came. I wouldn't put it past him, not for a moment." Henry, lounging in a chair near the window, rolled his eyes with mild exasperation. "Really, Mrs. Pettigrew, must you blame me for everything? I saw someone else, remember?" He waved vaguely toward the back of the vicarage. "I was only trying to get a drink. That's all." Lady Agatha Redfern, whose expression had been carefully neutral, chimed in. "I find it difficult to believe that a child could commit such a dreadful act. But one cannot discount the possibility that someone nearby, someone familiar with the vicarage, might have done it." Her gaze shifted ever so slightly toward the vicar, who seemed uncomfortably aware of her scrutiny. As evening approached, the tea remained cold, abandoned in saucers on tables, now scattered with evidence of interrupted festivity. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards, casting angular patterns over the faces of the villagers. Some were pale with fear, others with anticipation, and a few with the faintest hint of guilt or regret. Miss Marple, ever composed, sipped her tea at last. Her eyes wandered over the room one final time that day, noting the tiny details others overlooked. A faint smudge on the vicar's sleeve, the subtle tension in Lady Agatha's fingers, and the nervous twitch of Mrs. Pettigrew's jaw. Each told a story far richer than any words spoken aloud. "Yes," she murmured to herself, almost inaudibly, "there is more to this than meets the eye, and the threads will unravel, one by one, in time." Outside, the wind carried the distant bells of St. Mary Mead's church. Inside, a village cloaked in holiday cheer masked a growing fear that a murderer walked among them, quiet, unseen, and perhaps smiling, and Miss Marple, seated calmly in her corner, waited, observing, listening, understanding, knowing that patience would reveal what panic could not. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke beneath a delicate frost, the village streets glinting like sugar crystals in the weak winter sun. Yet the beauty of the season did little to warm hearts troubled by the night's tragedy. Mr. Thomas Albright's death hung over the village like a pall, coloring conversations with suspicion and unease. Miss Marple, as was her custom, began her day with quiet observation. The vicarage remained closed to the public, cordoned off by the local constable. Villagers still gathered in small clusters near the edge of the property, exchanging hurried whispers about who might have committed such a heinous act. Miss Marple strolled along the frost-lined lanes, greeting familiar faces with her usual gentle smile, though her mind was anything but idle. She paused at the baker's shop, which now seemed oddly hollow, its front windows clouded with grief rather than flour dust. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mary, the baker's assistant, eyes red from tears. "It's all so dreadful. I still can't believe it happened right here, in our peaceful village." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze flicking to the small flour streaks on Mary's apron. "Tell me, Mary, did Thomas seem worried about anything yesterday? Or was he his usual cheerful self?" Mary hesitated, wringing her hands. He did mention a disagreement with someone over the Christmas supplies, but he laughed it off, said it was nothing. I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Small tensions often disguise the largest grievances. "Thank you, dear. You've been very helpful," she continued on, her mind quietly cataloging every piece of information, no matter how trivial it seemed. Returning to the vicarage, she observed the arrival of Inspector Crayford and his assistant, notebook in hand. They began their methodical inspection, taking careful notes and photographing the scene, though Miss Marple noticed with quiet amusement that they seemed to focus almost exclusively on the physical evidence: flour smudges, scuff marks, and a slightly ajar pantry door, the things that had caught her attention, elicited only passing glances from them. Inside, the remaining villagers gathered in the drawing room under Crayford's questioning. Each was asked to recount their actions during the Christmas tea, and Miss Marple listened attentively, her mind mapping out contradictions, hesitations, and the subtle cues of guilt or concealment. Lady Agatha Redfern, ever proud and composed, recounted that she had been arranging flowers and ensuring the vicar's guests were comfortable. Her story was precise, almost rehearsed, yet her hands fidgeted beneath her muff, betraying a nervous energy. Miss Marple made a mental note. People who overcompensated with order often hid a deeper agitation. Reverend Hargreaves, still flushed from the previous day's alarm, insisted that he had been occupied with last-minute calls and preparations for the church's Christmas Eve service. His voice wavered slightly, and he avoided meeting anyone's gaze for too long, particularly Miss Marple's. Henry Barton, the boy whose previous afternoon's shadow sighting had stirred curiosity, now fidgeted at the edge of the group, casting occasional glances toward the kitchen door. Miss Marple observed the way he tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, an unconscious rhythm betraying impatience, anxiety, or perhaps an attempt to mask nervousness. Mrs. Pettigrew, predictably, whispered numerous conjectures, some entirely fantastical, about motives ranging from jealousy to revenge. "I wouldn't put it past anyone," she exclaimed. "The village has more secrets than anyone imagines." Miss Marple merely nodded. Secrets, indeed. They often revealed themselves in the most ordinary behaviors. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple ventured into the kitchen under the pretense of offering the vicarage staff tea and a kind word. She examined the scene carefully. The pantry door was still slightly ajar. The knife lay in the same place as yesterday, and a faint trace of powdered sugar had collected near the floorboards. More importantly, she noted the direction of the scuff marks. Evidence, perhaps, of hurried movement toward the back door. She crouched slightly, peering at the marks, and a tiny insight occurred to her. The perpetrator had not fled directly from the body. Instead, they had moved in a particular pattern, seemingly attempting to mislead anyone who might observe the crime scene. Only someone familiar with the kitchen's layout could maneuver in such a manner without hesitation. Later, as Miss Marple joined the villagers in the drawing room once more, she observed the subtle shifts in conversation. Gossip was never reliable, but behavior often was. Lady Agatha frequently glanced toward the vicar, who shifted uneasily in his chair. Mrs. Pettigrew fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, wringing it repeatedly, while Henry's foot tapped a restless rhythm. Each movement, each glance, and each hesitation spoke volumes to her trained eye. She found herself drawn to a seemingly inconsequential remark made by the vicar. "Thomas was a dear man," he said quietly. "He did not deserve—" He trailed off, his voice catching. The pause was fleeting but telling. Miss Marple filed the subtle inflection away, noting that even the kindest words could hide unease or conceal guilt. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Crayford had compiled an initial report, but had drawn no conclusions. He focused on what was obvious: the knife, the location of the body, and the possibility of an intruder. Miss Marple, however, understood that the truth would lie not in the physical evidence, but in the relationships, resentments, and long-hidden grievances that simmered beneath the village's polite exterior. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the day in quiet observation. She watched the villagers interact with one another, noting patterns, pauses, and tiny gestures. A nod here, a flinch there, a hesitation in speech. Each was a clue, invisible to the untrained eye, but crucial to understanding the full picture. By evening, she returned to her small room, her mind alive with connections. Flour smudges, scuff marks, and misplaced objects. These were details others dismissed, yet they were threads in the fabric of the mystery. And human behavior, she reminded herself, was often the loudest signal in the absence of overt evidence. As she prepared for bed, she penned a few quiet notes, organizing her thoughts. Lady Agatha's nervous composure, the vicar's evasive manner, Henry's calculated indifference, and Mrs. Pettigrew's exaggerated theatrics. Each was a piece of a puzzle that, though incomplete, was beginning to form a pattern. Outside, snow began to fall, light and silent, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a deceptive serenity. Within the vicarage, however, a storm of human emotion, hidden motives, and subtle deceit had taken hold, and Miss Marple, patient and unassuming, was already unraveling the threads that no one else had noticed. The village had reacted, the gossip had spread, and the police had begun their investigation. But the real work, the careful reading of human nature, had only just begun. By the following morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had grown thick with unease. The Christmas tea had passed into village history, but its shadow lingered over every doorstep, every shop, and every conversation. Inspector Crayford had begun formal interviews, and the first theory had already taken root. Someone known to Mr. Albright had killed him, not an outsider. The villagers, naturally, had opinions, and they were eager to share them. Mrs. Pettigrew, who prided herself on her insight into human affairs, was particularly vocal. "It must have been Henry Barton," she declared, addressing anyone who would listen. "He was always lurking about, a mischievous boy, and you saw how he ran when the scream came. I wouldn't put it past him, not for a moment." Henry, lounging in a chair near the window, rolled his eyes with mild exasperation. "Really, Mrs. Pettigrew, must you blame me for everything? I saw someone else, remember?" He waved vaguely toward the back of the vicarage. "I was only trying to get a drink. That's all." Lady Agatha Redfern, whose expression had been carefully neutral, chimed in. I find it difficult to believe that a child could commit such a dreadful act, but one cannot discount the possibility that someone nearby, someone familiar with the vicarage, might have done it. Her gaze shifted ever so slightly toward the vicar, who seemed uncomfortably aware of her scrutiny. Miss Marple observed quietly, as always, the obvious suspect, young Henry, fit neatly into the narrative the villagers wanted. A familiar, restless boy present at the scene. Yet her instincts, honed over decades of observing human nature, whispered caution. The truth, she knew, was seldom as simple as the first theory offered. Inspector Crayford, methodical and direct, addressed the group. We must consider motive. Did anyone have a grievance with Mr. Albright? Any disputes, financial or personal? Even the smallest quarrel could be significant. A hush fell over the room as villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Mrs. Pettigrew cleared her throat. Well, there was the matter of the Christmas supplies. Mr. Albright and young Henry had a minor disagreement yesterday, I heard. But surely that could not. She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Henry frowned. That's absurd. It wasn't a real argument, just a silly misunderstanding about who was to fetch the last of the flour. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn elsewhere. She noted Lady Agatha's carefully poised hands, the subtle tension in Reverend Hargreaves's shoulders, and the almost imperceptible narrowing of Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes. There was more beneath the surface, threads invisible to those eager for a quick resolution. Crayford pressed on, turning his gaze toward Henry. You were seen near the kitchen at the time of the murder. Can anyone corroborate your whereabouts? Henry shifted uncomfortably. No one, really. But I didn't do anything. I swear it. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, observed the boy's movements. There was truth in his agitation, she thought. A guilty person seldom fidgeted in the precise rhythm Henry exhibited. The motions were not frantic or irregular, but measured, almost like nervous energy seeking release, not concealment. The inspector sighed. Well, that complicates matters. Perhaps we need to widen the scope. Let us not assume motive solely from superficial observations. Who else had reasons to dislike Mr. Albright? A brief silence followed before Lady Agatha spoke. Thomas Albright had been outspoken about certain parish affairs. Some villagers, though I hesitate to name them, were less than pleased with his opinions regarding the Christmas preparations. One might speculate that resentment could have built quietly over time. Reverend Hargreaves added carefully, I'm aware of disagreements, yes, but nothing that would lead anyone to this. He paused, swallowing. Nothing serious, at least. Mrs. Pettigrew leaned forward eagerly. You see, even the vicar admits there were tensions. One cannot rule out long-held grudges. Perhaps there were arguments we never even knew about. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the group, noting the small nuances of expression. Lady Agatha's eyes flicked momentarily toward the vicar when discussing tensions, and the vicar's hand tightened slightly around the edge of his chair. Subtle cues, fleeting gestures. They spoke of suppressed emotion, of careful concealment. The inspector, perhaps sensing the dead end of obvious suspects, turned toward Miss Marple. And what do you think, Miss Marple? You've been observing quietly. Who seems most suspicious to you? She smiled faintly, her fingers steepled over her teacup. Oh, Inspector, I observe more than I conclude. At present, the most suspicious person is rarely the one who committed the act. Often the obvious answer is simply a distraction from a more complex truth. Crayford frowned but nodded, accustomed to Miss Marple's subtle warnings. Very well, but we must start somewhere. Henry Barton remains the person present at the scene. Shall we question him further? By all means, Miss Marple murmured softly, but observe carefully how he responds. Sometimes innocence shows more clearly in behavior than in words. The inspector approached Henry, noting the boy's continued composure despite the mounting attention. Miss Marple watched the interaction with keen interest. Henry's hands did not clench. His eyes did not dart to avoid scrutiny. Yet he tapped a small rhythm with his foot, a nervous habit perhaps, but not one consistent with guilt. Meanwhile, the villagers began speculating openly. Some whispered that Lady Agatha might have had motives, pointing to her pride and rigid adherence to propriety. Others suggested that Reverend Hargreaves, eager to maintain his reputation, might have lashed out at Albright in a moment of concealed frustration. Even Mrs. Pettigrew was not above suspicion, given her tendency to intervene in others' affairs. Miss Marple noted the layering of these conjectures, appreciating how fear and imagination distorted the simplest facts. The human mind, she knew, was adept at creating patterns even where none existed, and yet, in these patterns, subtle truths often hid in plain sight. By late afternoon, Crayford had recorded statements from all present, though his conclusions remained tentative. He noted Henry as a primary suspect, pending further evidence, while Miss Marple silently catalogued each person's subtle tells. The twitch of a lip, the hesitation in speech, the brief glance of anxiety. As the sun dipped low over the frost-laden village, Miss Marple retreated to her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the streets were quiet, lined with snow-covered hedges, yet inside, the storm of suspicion and subtle deception raged. She sipped her tea, reflecting quietly. The obvious suspect, young Henry, was merely the first layer, a convenient focal point for fear and conjecture. But she knew the true answer lay beneath, hidden in human behavior, subtle gestures, and carefully guarded secrets. Yes, she thought, the village had selected its scapegoat, but Miss Marple, patient and watchful, would not be fooled by appearances. The threads were tangled, yet they would unravel, and when they did, the true culprit would be revealed, not through panic, not through accusation, but through careful observation of the human heart. The morning after the first round of questioning, St. Mary Mead was quiet in a way that felt unusual. The shops opened later than usual, and villagers walked the streets with a cautious deliberation, as though each step might awaken a hidden danger. Miss Marple, however, moved through the village with her usual calm, her eyes alert to the minutiae that others disregarded. Her first stop was the vicarage, where the inspector was already poring over his notes, clipboard balanced precariously in one hand. The police had focused on the obvious: the knife, the scuff marks, the presence of Henry Barton near the scene. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to subtler details, small irregularities that spoke louder than the evidence others deemed significant. She entered the kitchen under the guise of checking on the remaining staff, though in truth, she was examining every corner of the room. The pantry door remained slightly ajar. The knife had been cleaned yet placed with peculiar care, and the faint flour smudge on the floor was still visible, nearly imperceptible to anyone untrained in observation. Miss Marple crouched slightly, her sharp eyes following the faint trail that led not toward the back door, as one might expect, but toward the spice cabinet. A small, almost invisible mark caught her attention, a streak of powdered sugar, barely distinguishable from the frost-like dusting on the floor. It led directly to a tiny dent in the cabinet door, as if someone had struck it in haste, or perhaps deliberately nudged it while moving about the kitchen. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Curious, she murmured to herself. She knelt closer, examining the edge of the cabinet. A tiny fragment of paper protruded, caught in the door hinge. Carefully she extracted it. It was a receipt, partially torn, with neat handwriting listing ingredients: sugar, flour, cloves, cinnamon. What made it unusual was not the items themselves, but the timing noted at the top, 11:17 a.m., a precise moment that contradicted the timeline offered by several villagers. Miss Marple's mind whirred. The receipt suggested that someone had been in the kitchen shortly before the murder, and the timing did not match the stories given to the inspector. It was a minor detail, almost invisible, but it implied a deliberate misdirection. She rose, tucking the receipt carefully into her pocket. Observation, she reminded herself, was more valuable than speculation. One small clue, unnoticed by others, could unravel an entire web of deception. Later that day, she visited the baker's shop again. Mary was arranging pastries behind the counter, her eyes still red from days of anxiety. "Mary," Miss Marple said softly, "do you remember the timing of Mr. Albright's activities yesterday? Did he send anyone to the kitchen at any particular time?" Mary frowned. "Well, he usually went himself, but he did ask me to fetch a few supplies around 11 o'clock. I think it was shortly before the tea began." She paused, glancing at Miss Marple. "Why, did you find something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps, dear. Only small details, but sometimes small details tell us more than loud declarations." The subtlety of her words seemed to reassure Mary, though it left her puzzled. Miss Marple was learning to read the invisible patterns of human behavior, and each new detail brought her closer to understanding the sequence that led to the tragedy. Back at the vicarage, the inspector had begun to examine the guests' statements more critically, though he remained preoccupied with the obvious inconsistencies. Miss Marple, unobtrusively, began her quiet questioning, engaging the villagers in casual conversation designed to elicit involuntary reveals. Lady Agatha Redfern, for instance, mentioned in passing that she had been adjusting decorations in the drawing-room at the time of the murder. Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation in her voice when specifying exactly which decorations. A small pause, almost imperceptible, yet telling. The vicar, when asked about the movement of staff during the tea, offered a precise timeline, but seemed slightly flustered when questioned further. Miss Marple caught the way his fingers fiddled with his cufflinks, a gesture of nervous concealment rather than mere habit. Henry Barton, ever restless, made a passing remark about the scent of sugar in the kitchen, a detail that seemed almost too casual to be innocent. Miss Marple filed it away carefully. Children were often less skilled at hiding their observations, yet their comments were rarely taken seriously. Mrs. Pettigrew, predictably, added layers of speculation, though Miss Marple noticed that some of her claims contained small embellishments or inconsistencies, telltale signs of a mind eager to narrate events in a way that suited her own narrative rather than the truth. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple returned to the kitchen, studying the flow of movement one more time. She traced the scuff marks, examined the dusting of flour, and noted the trajectory of the tiny sugar streaks. They formed a pattern, seemingly random, yet deliberate in its misdirection. Whoever had moved through the kitchen had been careful to appear clumsy, to create a false path away from the true point of interest. The spice cabinet and the hidden note it concealed. That afternoon, the realization settled quietly in her mind. The murder had been staged to mislead the casual observer. Flour smudges, knife placement, and hurried movements were deliberate decoys. The crucial detail, invisible to the untrained eye, was that the culprit had lingered near the pantry and the spice cabinet, where the hidden receipt had been inadvertently left behind. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair by the window, contemplating the implications. The receipt, a minor clue overlooked by everyone else, was more than a trivial slip. It was a deliberate thread, leading toward the truth. The question now was not simply who had been present, but who had the knowledge and opportunity to manipulate the scene so carefully. She sipped her tea, her mind piecing together the chain of events with quiet precision. One small observation, a mere fragment of paper, was enough to challenge the assumptions of the villagers and the police alike. The murderer had left an invisible signature, a trace designed to be missed, yet for Miss Marple it shone clearly. And as the last rays of winter sunlight glinted through the frosted windows, Miss Marple knew that this hidden clue would be the key. Not only would it expose the true sequence of events, but it would also illuminate the mind behind the crime, a mind subtle, calculating, and dangerously clever. The village remained unaware. They clung to the obvious suspect, to the narrative that comforted them, but Miss Marple, ever patient, observed quietly, ready to follow the hidden threads wherever they led. Yes, she thought, the puzzle was beginning to take shape, and soon the truth, small and delicate as a fragment of paper, would reveal everything. The village of St. Mary Mead rarely witnessed such tension as it did in the days following Mr. Albright's murder. Ordinary routines, baking, shopping, casual strolls, now seemed laden with suspicion, each interaction a potential betrayal. Miss Marple, as always, moved through the village with calm purpose, noticing every nuance, every subtle exchange that others failed to see. That afternoon she paid a visit to Lady Agatha Redfern. The grand house she entered was filled with the scent of polished wood, waxed floors, and the faint hint of expensive perfume. Lady Agatha received her in the drawing-room, seated stiffly in an armchair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully composed. "Miss Marple," Lady Agatha began, her tone polite but guarded. "I trust you are well, though. I confess I do not understand why you continue to probe when Inspector Crayford has been doing his work." Miss Marple smiled softly. "It is not probing, Lady Agatha. One merely observes, and sometimes observing quietly reveals more than asking questions aloud." Lady Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle sign that did not escape Miss Marple. "You think someone in St. Mary Mead is lying to you?" "Perhaps not lying," Miss Marple said, "but withholding. We all have secrets, Lady Agatha, and sometimes those secrets lead to terrible consequences." Lady Agatha's hands clenched briefly before she composed herself. "Very well. If you wish to understand, I suppose it cannot be helped. But you will find nothing here." Miss Marple inclined her head and, over tea, began a delicate inquiry. She listened as Lady Agatha spoke of her social obligations, the church committees, and the meticulous planning required for the Christmas tea. Yet, through her careful questioning, Miss Marple gently drew out a revelation. Lady Agatha had been frustrated with Mr. Albright's criticism of her floral arrangements, deeming them unsuitable for the festive mood. Small, perhaps, but indicative of deeper irritation, a minor crack in the otherwise polished facade. Next, Miss Marple visited Reverend Hargreaves, who greeted her in the vicarage study, surrounded by stacks of hymnals and church notices. His hands shook slightly as he poured tea. "I cannot imagine why anyone would harm Thomas," he said, voice low. "He was a good man, generous, cheerful, even with his occasional stubbornness." Miss Marple noted his emphasis on Albright's virtues, yet his hands betrayed a hidden tension, his knuckles white against the teacup handle. "Were there any conflicts, Reverend? Small disagreements? Perhaps with those involved in the Christmas preparations?" Hargreaves hesitated. "Yes, a few minor disputes. Nothing serious. Thomas had strong opinions, and some parishioners disagreed. But I never imagined it could lead to—" He broke off, lowering his eyes. Miss Marple sipped her tea, gently prompting him. "It is not always the loud disputes that matter, Reverend. Sometimes it is the quiet, simmering ones. He sighed. Very well. There were moments. Lady Agatha disagreed with him, naturally, but also some villagers resented Thomas's insistence on proper procedures. Small disagreements. Insignificant, I believed. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each subtle admission, layering them with prior observations. Hidden resentments, however minor, could combine into motive in ways outsiders rarely anticipated. Later, she returned to the vicarage drawing-room, where Mrs. Pettigrew had gathered with a few others, eager to recount her version of events. "I always said there was more beneath the surface," she insisted, tapping her fingers against her knee. "Thomas had enemies. I have known it for years. Even that young Henry Barton, so quiet, so observant. He may seem innocent, but who knows what is hidden behind those eyes?" Miss Marple observed Henry, reclining with an air of casual disinterest, yet noting the way he subtly shifted when Mrs. Pettigrew mentioned him. A flicker of unease crossed his features before he masked it. Miss Marple filed it away, understanding that innocence and guilt alike could manifest in tiny gestures. It was then that a surprising figure entered. Mr. Edwin Carstairs, a minor local businessman who had not been at the Christmas tea, but whose connections to both Albright and several villagers were known. Carstairs' expression was grave, his coat dusted with frost from the cold streets. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I fear you may not be aware of certain tensions that existed between Mr. Albright and myself. Nothing personal, merely business disagreements, though some may have taken them more seriously than intended." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Business disagreements can be revealing, Mr. Carstairs. Even minor financial tensions may generate resentment strong enough to lead to unforeseen acts." Carstairs nodded slowly. "Indeed, and I have reason to suspect that some of the village's quieter residents, those who observe but rarely speak, may harbor grudges that are far older than the surface suggests." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple realized the village was layered with motives and subtle hostilities. Lady Agatha's pride, the vicar's carefully concealed frustrations, Henry's restless curiosity, Mrs. Pettigrew's penchant for exaggeration, and Mr. Carstairs's quiet resentment, all these threads intertwined. Each could, under the right circumstances, lead to tragedy. Yet among these revelations, Miss Marple found a small pattern emerging. The suspects' behaviors, though seemingly unrelated, revealed more than they intended. Lady Agatha's insistence on order, Hargreaves's unease with minor conflicts, and Henry's almost imperceptible reactions to insinuations all hinted at awareness of circumstances beyond the immediate facts. Miss Marple retired to a quiet corner of the vicarage later that evening. She reflected on the day's subtle confrontations and confessions. Every individual she had spoken to carried layers of secrecy and personal history, each shaping their potential motives in nuanced ways. A minor irritation, a long-forgotten slight, or even a fleeting jealousy could tip someone toward action under the pressure of opportunity. Outside, snow began to drift lazily from the gray sky, covering St. Mary Mead in silence. Inside, the quiet was deceptive. Villagers carried their secrets like heavy coats, warming themselves with lies, half-truths, and carefully chosen words. Miss Marple understood that the murder had not arisen from a single, impulsive act, but from a complex web of hidden grievances, small resentments, and unspoken desires. She sipped her tea, noting each detail: Lady Agatha's tension, Hargreaves's nervous glances, Henry's subtle unease, Mrs. Pettigrew's theatricality, and Carstairs's restrained anger. These layers of secrecy formed a lattice through which the truth could be traced, but only if one observed quietly and patiently. Yes, she thought, The villagers' confrontations and confessions had revealed much. Yet the most telling secrets were not those freely offered. They lay hidden, revealed only through behavior, hesitation, and subtle inconsistencies. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would uncover them all. The village of St. Mary Mead might appear peaceful, dusted in snow and festive cheer, but beneath its surface simmered resentments, jealousies, and long-buried grievances, and from these shadows the path to the murderer could be traced. If one knew how to read between the lines, Miss Marple, ever composed, smiled faintly to herself. The pieces were beginning to form a clearer pattern, and soon the true depths of the village's secrets would emerge, as quietly and inexorably as the falling snow outside. St. Mary Mead awoke to a chill sharper than usual, as if the village itself had sensed the new turn of events. Just when the residents had begun adjusting to the tension following Mr. Albright's murder, the tranquility was shattered again, this time in a subtler, more insidious way. The first news arrived at the vicarage in the form of a hastily scribbled note delivered by the postman. Inspector Crayford opened it, frowning at the neat, almost deliberate handwriting. Miss Marple, seated nearby in her favorite corner, glanced over his shoulder. The note read simply, "The truth is not where you are looking. Search the library." Crayford's eyebrows knitted. A prank, perhaps, or someone trying to mislead the investigation. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her expression calm. "Pranks are rarely written in such careful handwriting, Inspector, and the specificity, the library, suggests the sender wishes to redirect attention, perhaps to conceal something else." The villagers were quickly summoned to the vicarage. Whispers filled the room like restless shadows, each voice layered with curiosity, fear, or guilt. Lady Agatha Redfern, ever composed, regarded the note with subtle suspicion. "This is preposterous," she murmured, though her lips were pressed tightly, betraying her unease. Henry Barton, restless as ever, leaned forward eagerly. "Do you think it's a clue? Maybe Thomas wanted someone to find something. Something important? Or someone wants to confuse us?" Mrs. Pettigrew said sharply, clutching her handkerchief as if it were a talisman against uncertainty. "Mischief is afoot. I always suspected this village has more secrets than we know." Miss Marple, however, considered the note carefully. The handwriting, the phrasing, the timing. It suggested subtle intelligence rather than chaos. Whoever had left it was calculating, trying to manipulate the investigation while remaining unseen. And the library, she realized, was a place seldom frequented by the majority of villagers, but intimately familiar to someone with knowledge of Albright's habits. "Let us go to the library," she said gently. Her voice carried a quiet authority that drew the villagers forward. They moved in a hesitant procession, Crayford leading, Miss Marple close behind, and the others trailing with whispered speculations. The library was dim, the afternoon sun filtering weakly through frost-streaked windows. Rows of books, old and new, lined the walls, each a silent witness to the lives of St. Mary Mead's residents. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the shelves, noting the small irregularities. A book slightly out of place, the faint impression of recent movement across the carpet, and the smell of old paper disturbed by hurried hands. "Look here," Inspector Crayford said, pointing to a stack of books on the central table. They had been shifted, as though rifled through in haste. Perhaps the writer of this note intended to draw our attention to these. Miss Marple approached, her sharp eyes catching what Crayford missed. A small, folded piece of paper tucked between the pages of a heavy leather-bound ledger. She extracted it carefully. The note was brief. "Observe carefully. The path you follow may lead to a shadow. but the shadows not the culprit. A murmur ran through the villagers. Lady Agatha's fingers trembled slightly as she touched her scarf. Henry's eyes sparkled with intrigue. Even Mrs. Pettigrew looked momentarily subdued. Unsure how to interpret the cryptic message, Miss Marple, however, saw the deeper implication. The sender was deliberately diverting attention, creating a false narrative of shadows and misdirection. Whoever had committed the murder understood human nature, how people react to hints, how fear and curiosity could be used as tools. Crayford looked puzzled. This seems deliberately vague, but why lead us here at all? And why leave it so openly? Precisely to manipulate your attention, Inspector. Miss Marple replied calmly. The person responsible wishes to remain unseen while guiding others toward inconsequential details. It is the very subtleness of the act that hides the truth. Henry, fidgeting near the window, suddenly spoke. "Wait, look at the books over there. That one seems out of place." He pointed toward a shelf where a large, leather-bound volume had been pushed slightly forward, unlike the others. Miss Marple approached, noting the subtle protrusion. She gently pulled the book forward, revealing another folded note, this one stained faintly with what appeared to be flour. Residual traces from the kitchen. The handwriting matched the previous notes. It read, "Do not trust the first face you see. Look closer at those who speak softly." A tense silence fell over the group. The cryptic phrasing seemed to allude to someone in their midst, someone who had not drawn attention, but had observed and manipulated the course of events carefully. Lady Agatha glanced around nervously. The vicar adjusted his collar. Mrs. Pettigrew clutched her handkerchief, eyes wide with anxiety. Miss Marple folded the note carefully, her mind piecing together its significance. The killer was methodical, capable of subtle deception, and confident enough to leave hints without fear of discovery. The focus on shadows, misdirection, and understated behavior aligned with what she had already observed in the villagers' reactions and movements. She turned her gaze to Henry, who looked between the adults, clearly intrigued, yet unaware of the depth of implication. "Sometimes the obvious is merely a mask," she murmured. "The shadows we see are rarely what they seem." Crayford, despite his methodical approach, began to feel the unease that Miss Marple had long sensed. Each cryptic note was a deliberate psychological tool, guiding the investigation while concealing the true culprit. He realized that to follow the physical evidence alone would be insufficient. He needed insight into human behavior, a domain where Miss Marple excelled. Miss Marple, meanwhile, reflected on the minor details that had initially seemed trivial. The flour smudges in the kitchen, the misplaced pantry door, the faint fingerprints on the knife. Combined with these cryptic notes, she now understood that the murderer's strategy was psychological. Create confusion, highlight red herrings, and manipulate reactions. As the villagers departed the library, whispers and speculation renewed, but Miss Marple remained, quietly observing the subtle shifts in expression, posture, and gaze. Each villager reacted differently, Lady Agatha with restrained anxiety, Hargreaves with barely perceptible guilt, Henry with curiosity and excitement, Mrs. Pettigrew with exaggerated horror, and Carstairs with a cool detachment. The snow outside deepened, covering St. Mary Mead in silent white. Within, the tension thickened, and the first layer of misdirection had taken root. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the patterns and behaviors. Each cryptic note, each subtle gesture, was a thread leading to the unseen puppeteer orchestrating this drama. And in her quiet, observant way, she knew that the twist was not merely the notes themselves, but the revelation that the murderer had anticipated every reaction, every assumption. The true puzzle lay not in shadows, but in understanding the mind that created them. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, serene yet alert. The game was no longer straightforward. The murderer was clever, patient, and unseen. But Miss Marple had begun to trace the invisible path, piece by subtle piece. Yes, she thought, the shadows were misleading, but even shadows cast a trace, and she would follow it until the truth emerged. The frost on St. Mary Mead's streets had thickened overnight, and the village moved cautiously through the morning. The murder of Mr. Albright, combined with the cryptic notes discovered in the library, had unsettled the residents. Rumors flitted through the village like restless birds, each whisper sharpening suspicion. But Miss Marple, ever composed, approached the day with the quiet determination of a patient chess player contemplating her next move. She had decided it was time to test the villagers' reactions, to observe them under carefully controlled circumstances. Crayford, methodical as ever, continued to pursue physical evidence, yet Miss Marple knew the truth would be revealed in human behavior, not fingerprints. Her plan began with an invitation to the vicarage drawing room. Lady Agatha, Reverend Hargreaves, Henry Barton, Mrs. Pettigrew, and Mr. Edwin Carstairs were all present, each unaware of the subtle psychological experiment Miss Marple intended. Tea was served in delicate porcelain cups, the steaming liquid reflecting the faint winter sunlight that filtered through frosted windows. Miss Marple, seated near the center, addressed the group gently. "I have been reflecting on the events surrounding our dear Mr. Albright. It is remarkable how small details can illuminate so much. Yet, as often happens, the truth can be obscured by distractions, gestures, words, even attitudes." Lady Agatha tensed slightly, smoothing the folds of her dress. Hargreaves adjusted his glasses nervously. Henry leaned forward, curiosity alight in his eyes, while Mrs. Pettigrew clutched her handkerchief with theatrical concern. Carstairs remained calm, his hands folded neatly, though a faint flicker of awareness crossed his eyes. Miss Marple continued. "Consider, for instance, the cryptic notes discovered in the library. They suggested misdirection, implying shadows and false leads. And yet the one who wrote them must be intimately familiar with our surroundings, our routines, and our reactions." Her words hung in the air. She deliberately avoided specifying names, yet her tone implied scrutiny. Eyes shifted subtly among the group, each person instinctively evaluating their own response. "Let us play a small exercise," she proposed, her voice soft but steady. "I shall recount certain moments from the Christmas tea, and I ask each of you to observe silently and consider your reactions. Sometimes what we feel inside manifests more clearly than what we say." She began with a seemingly innocuous story about the tea arrangements, deliberately emphasizing the moments when Mr. Albright had moved through the room, conversed with guests, and handled the sugar and flour. Each detail was chosen to prompt a reaction from those who might feel implicated or nervous. Lady Agatha's hands tightened around her teacup, her knuckles whitening. Hargreaves's gaze fell to the floor, a faint flush creeping over his cheeks. Henry's eyes darted momentarily to the pantry door, then returned to Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Pettigrew gasped lightly, almost theatrically, while Carstairs leaned back, expression unreadable, though a subtle tension ran through his shoulders. Miss Marple noted these reactions carefully. "Curious," she murmured, "how the mind recalls events differently depending on our involvement, our concerns, or our awareness of consequences." She continued, recounting a minor incident, a small spill of sugar, unnoticed by most at the time, but carefully observed by Mr. Albright. Each person's response was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet to her trained eye, revealing. Lady Agatha's eyes flicked toward the cupboard where the sugar had been stored. Hargreaves's throat cleared nervously. Henry's foot tapped a distinct rhythm, rapid but controlled. Carstairs' jaw tightened, the slightest quiver betraying his outward composure. Miss Marple paused, allowing the moment to settle. When we are placed in situations where truth and misdirection coexist, she said softly, our behavior often reveals more than our words. The smallest gesture can betray awareness, guilt, or pretense. Mrs. Pettigrew, eager to contribute, interjected. I always said someone had to be hiding something. And now look at them all. Their faces. Miss Marple gently raised a hand, silencing her. Patience, Mrs. Pettigrew. Observation without comment is far more revealing than speculation. She then shifted her attention to Henry. And what of our young friend? Children often notice what adults overlook. Do you see the patterns in what has been observed, Henry? Henry's eyes widened. I notice things. But it's hard to know what's important. Sometimes the obvious isn't the truth, right? Exactly, Miss Marple replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. Sometimes the simplest observation, such as a smudge of flour, a misplaced object, or a glance, carries more weight than the loudest accusation. Turning toward the adults, she continued, and yet the cleverest among us will use such subtleties to mislead. The one who understands human nature well can orchestrate events so that others see shadows, while the truth hides in plain sight. Her words, seemingly casual, were carefully designed to provoke responses. Each villager shifted in their seat, some with tension, some with curiosity, and some with defensive composure. Miss Marple observed every flicker, every hesitation, every twitch, a symphony of human behavior that slowly unveiled the layers of truth. Finally, she posed a gentle, almost offhand question. If you were to commit a clever deception designed to mislead those who observe you, how would you proceed? Where would you leave traces, and what would you emphasize? Lady Agatha's lips pressed together tightly. Hargreaves glanced toward the door, as if imagining escape. Henry's brow furrowed, his mind clearly racing. Mrs. Pettigrew's handkerchief trembled in her fingers, and Carstairs' eyes met Miss Marple's directly, a faint flicker of acknowledgment passing between them. Miss Marple noted the reactions with quiet satisfaction. Each response, each micro-expression, each gesture had revealed more than any direct questioning could have achieved. Some had revealed anxiety, some deception, and some careful control, but all had provided clues to their inner state, clues invisible to the casual observer. By the end of the session, the villagers departed with uneasy murmurs, leaving Miss Marple alone with her observations. She set down her teacup, hands folded, reflecting on the patterns she had witnessed. Each reaction, each gesture, each subtle hesitation had created a map of hidden truths and veiled intentions. The puzzle was coming into sharper focus. The clues were subtle, the motives layered, and the deception deliberate. And Miss Marple, patient and unassuming, now possessed the understanding needed to discern not only who had acted, but why, and how they had orchestrated the events to mislead everyone else. Outside, the snow fell silently, a cold and pristine veil over St. Mary Mead. Within the vicarage, the tension remained, unseen yet palpable, as Miss Marple prepared for the final revelations that would expose the true culprit. The drawing room of the vicarage was filled with the muted warmth of afternoon light, filtered through frosted windows. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay blanketed in snow, serene and silent, a stark contrast to the tension within. The villagers had gathered once more, summoned by Miss Marple, though none knew precisely why. A hush settled over the room as she rose from her chair, hands clasped lightly before her, eyes calm but penetrating. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began softly, "I have spent these past days observing, listening, and considering. I have watched small gestures, listened to whispered admissions, and noted the inconsistencies that most overlooked. The truth, as it often does, lies not in loud proclamations, but in subtle signs." Lady Agatha Redfern adjusted her gloves, maintaining her composed demeanor, though her fingers twitched slightly. Reverend Hargreaves sat rigidly, as though bracing himself. Henry Barton leaned forward with wide eyes, eager but anxious, while Mrs. Pettigrew wrung her handkerchief, her mind racing with anticipation. Mr. Edwin Carstairs stood by the window, serene yet alert, as though calculating each word before speaking. Miss Marple continued. The crime itself was carefully staged. Flour smudges, the knife's position, the so-called hasty movements, all designed to mislead. The murderer relied on misdirection, guiding attention to shadows, to the obvious suspect, to the child who happened to be present. Yet the true solution was never in what was most visible. It was in the smallest, almost invisible traces. She held up the fragment of the receipt she had discovered in the pantry, the one with the precise timing noted. This, though minor, was the first thread. It revealed the murderer's presence in the kitchen at a moment inconsistent with the statements given. Alone, it might have been dismissed, but combined with subtle behavioral clues, it formed the beginning of the truth. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on each villager. We all harbor minor resentments, small frustrations, and carefully guarded secrets. Some express them openly, some hide them skillfully. But when opportunity arises, even the smallest impulse can drive a person to acts of unexpected consequence. Our murderer understood this and used it to mask their intentions. Henry shifted in his seat, fidgeting with his scarf. "Miss Marple, do you mean someone here, someone we know?" She nodded, smiling faintly. "Indeed, Henry, the murderer is not an outsider. They are someone intimately familiar with the routines, habits, and, importantly, the psychology of our little village. Someone who could calculate how others would respond, and then use that understanding to create a narrative of misdirection." Mrs. Pettigrew gasped, clutching her handkerchief more tightly. "It can't be. It's impossible. We all knew them." Miss Marple's eyes rested on Lady Agatha. "It is indeed someone we know, someone whose demeanor suggested innocence, whose composure masked calculation, one who directed suspicion to others while concealing their own involvement." Lady Agatha's face blanched slightly, though she attempted to maintain control. "Miss Marple, this is most distressing. You cannot mean—" "Yes, I do," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "And yet, the solution is as simple as observing what the murderer could not entirely control. The subtle behavioral cues, the hesitation, the overcareful composure, and the unconscious reveals." She turned toward the vicar, who leaned forward, sensing what was coming. "Reverend Hargreaves, you were concerned with order and propriety, yes, but your gestures, the slight tension when discussing minor disputes, were consistent with someone observing events rather than initiating them." The Reverend's shoulders sagged slightly, relief washing faintly over him. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Henry. "Young Henry, your curiosity is admirable, and your observations were genuine. You noticed more than you realized, though your innocence was never in question." Henry blinked, relieved but still tense. Then her eyes rested on Carstairs. "And you, Mr. Carstairs, have remained calm throughout, presenting a composed exterior. Yet subtle cues betrayed your anxiety when minor inconsistencies were mentioned. and the cryptic notes, left deliberately to mislead, bear your handwriting's peculiar neatness and phrasing patterns, matching the fragments I discovered. Carstairs stiffened, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He looked around the room, realizing that Miss Marple's deductions had cornered him. You cannot know," he said, voice low but tense. "I can, Mr. Carstairs," Miss Marple replied gently. "You relied on misdirection, moving flower, placing the knife, creating false trails, and leaving cryptic notes to manipulate the investigation. You counted on the obvious suspect, Henry, to divert attention. Yet your careful orchestration could not entirely conceal the minor traces, the small inconsistencies, the reactions of those around you. Human nature cannot be entirely controlled, even by the cleverest mind." Lady Agatha clutched her gloves, wide-eyed. Mrs. Pettigrew whispered, "I knew there was more than met the eye." Carstairs' composure crumbled. "It was necessary," he admitted, his voice shaking. "I had debts, obligations. Albright discovered my mismanagement of funds. He threatened to expose me. I did not intend to kill him, but in a moment of panic, I struck and then tried to stage it to appear accidental, hoping suspicion would fall elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm, yet resolute. Indeed, panic, fear, and the desire to control perception led to the act. And then, in attempting to manipulate human observation, you left the subtle clues that betrayed your involvement. The room was silent, the villagers absorbing the revelation. Henry stared in shock. Mrs. Pettigrew dabbed at her eyes, and Lady Agatha exhaled, a mix of relief and horror on her face. Inspector Crayford stepped forward, nodding to Miss Marple. "Well done, Miss Marple. Your attention to detail and understanding of human behavior have solved what seemed an intractable case. Mr. Carstairs, you are under arrest." Carstairs made no attempt to resist, his shoulders slumping in resignation. The pattern of deceit had collapsed, and the careful orchestration of misdirection was laid bare. Miss Marple, finally settling back into her chair, reflected quietly. Human nature, she mused, is a delicate web of pride, fear, and desire. Even the most meticulous planning cannot entirely conceal the truth, for subtle gestures and unconscious behaviors speak louder than words. The villagers, though shaken, began to regain composure. They recognized, perhaps for the first time, the depth of insight and patience that Miss Marple possessed. Where others relied on assumption, she had observed. Where others pursued the obvious, she traced the hidden patterns of behavior. And as snow fell silently outside, blanketing the village in quiet serenity, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The case was solved, the guilty revealed, and yet the lessons of human nature remained. People were rarely what they seemed, and truth, no matter how carefully concealed, would always reveal itself to those who knew how to observe. For in St. Mary Mead, even under the most tranquil facade, hearts harbored secrets, and only the patient and perceptive could unravel them. Miss Marple, serene and ever vigilant, had done so with quiet precision once more. The first quiet snow of winter continued to settle over St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of cottages and the winding streets alike. The village, once buzzing with speculation and whispered gossip, now carried an air of uneasy relief. Mr. Carstairs had been taken into custody, the inspector's careful procedural work wrapping the legal aspect of the case. Yet it was the subtle, human truths Miss Marple had discerned that provided closure beyond mere justice. The vicarage, having served as the center of activity for the investigation, was slowly returning to its customary tranquility. Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair by the window, watched the villagers move about their routines with tentative normalcy. Children skated across the frozen pond near the edge of the village, their laughter echoing in crisp winter air. Shopkeepers arranged their wares, and the soft tinkle of bells announced the arrival of parishioners attending early services. Life, seemingly, was resuming its gentle rhythm. Lady Agatha Redfern had returned to her estate, yet she was not entirely at ease. The carefully maintained order of her home now seemed fragile, and she moved through her rooms with a cautious deliberation, straightening ornaments and brushing away the fine layer of snow that had drifted in from the unlatched windows. She had been shaken, certainly, but the knowledge that justice had been served provided a measure of comfort. Miss Marple's insight into her demeanor had revealed her as cautious yet honorable, someone whose pride had made her susceptible to initial suspicion, but whose conscience remained intact. Reverend Hargreaves resumed his parish duties, though the murder had left a subtle mark upon him. He moved more deliberately among his parishioners, speaking with gentle care, mindful of the vulnerability of those around him. The vicar's respect for Miss Marple's perceptiveness had grown. He understood that human observation, rather than physical evidence alone, had solved the mystery. His trust in the subtlety of human nature had been deepened by her quiet genius. Henry Barton, for his part, had become something of a minor hero in the eyes of the village children. They whispered excitedly of his presence during the investigation, his courage, and his uncanny ability to notice small details. Henry, though flattered, maintained his humility. Miss Marple had privately commended his attentiveness, and had even encouraged him to nurture the quiet skill of observation he had shown. It was a small victory for the boy. Though tempered by the gravity of the crime, Mrs. Pettigrew predictably remained both theatrical and vigilant. She frequently recounted the events to anyone who would listen, embellishing where memory failed, and emphasizing the suspense of the final revelation. Yet even she acknowledged, with some hesitation, the inevitability of Miss Marple's deductions. Her admiration for the elderly detective was begrudging, though sincere, and she began to understand the power of quiet observation over loud speculation. Miss Marple herself, however, remained largely unchanged in outward appearance. She continued to move about her home, tending her garden despite the frost, arranging her knitting, and sipping tea with deliberate slowness. Yet beneath this exterior of calm, she reflected deeply on the human nature she had witnessed over the past days. Each individual had played their role, revealing their strengths, weaknesses, and hidden inclinations. She thought particularly of Mr. Carstairs. The man had been clever, patient, and manipulative, yet he had underestimated the subtlety of human behavior. Even the most carefully constructed deception leaves traces, tiny inconsistencies in timing, gestures, or reactions that reveal more than words ever could. The cryptic notes meant to mislead ultimately illuminated his methodology rather than obscuring it. Miss Marple's understanding of these subtleties had allowed her to follow the invisible trail, tracing his thought process with precision. The villagers, too, would carry lessons from the experience. Suspicion and gossip had run rampant, but the resolution reminded them of the value of patience, observation, and trust. Misinterpretation could easily mislead, and assumptions based on appearances were unreliable. The community's cohesion, though momentarily shaken, would be strengthened by the awareness that truth, though hidden, could be uncovered through careful attention and a keen understanding of human motives. As the days passed, Miss Marple began to correspond quietly with the inspector, offering gentle suggestions for his ongoing investigations. Crayford had come to rely upon her insights, appreciating the depth of her understanding of human psychology. Together, they reflected on how minor details, a misplaced object, a fleeting gesture, or a seemingly innocuous remark, could unravel complex schemes. In her solitude, Miss Marple considered the broader implications of the crime. Human nature was rarely simple. Pride, fear, envy, and ambition often intertwined to produce actions far beyond what outsiders could predict. One need only observe patiently, ask minimal questions, and interpret carefully to see the patterns that defined behavior. Yet there was also a note of melancholy. Even when justice prevailed, the scars of deception and the tension of suspicion remained. The villagers would remember the events for years, some with gratitude, some with lingering unease, but Miss Marple, ever patient, accepted this as part of the human condition. Life, with its mysteries and moral complexities, continued regardless. On Christmas Eve, the village held a modest service at the church. Snow fell softly outside, muffling sound and light alike. Candles flickered in the windows, and the scent of pine filled the air. Villagers gathered quietly, reflecting upon the trials and revelations of the past days, though the shadow of the murder lingered faintly in their minds. It was tempered by a sense of resolution and community. Miss Marple, seated near the front, observed with her usual gentle scrutiny. Faces, gestures, and expressions all told stories beyond the spoken words. She noted the subtle ways in which relief and lingering anxiety coexisted in the villagers, and in that quiet reflection, she acknowledged the enduring complexity of human nature. When the service ended, the villagers stepped outside into the crisp, snowy night. Conversations resumed in subdued tones, and the ordinary rhythms of life slowly returned. The shopkeepers closed for the evening, children returned to their homes, and the quiet of the village deepened. Miss Marple walked home slowly, savoring the peacefulness, yet mindful that human nature remained as intricate and unpredictable as ever. She reached her cottage, where her cat greeted her with a soft meow. Settling into her favorite chair, she reflected upon the events with calm satisfaction. Justice had been served, but the real triumph lay in understanding, the patient, careful discernment of behavior, the attention to subtlety, and the quiet unraveling of a human puzzle. And as the snow continued to drift down, blanketing St. Mary Mead in serene white, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The village would endure, its secrets partially revealed, its lessons quietly absorbed, and the rhythm of daily life once again restored. For Miss Marple, the case of the Christmas tea had confirmed what she had always known. Even in the quietest of villages, human nature contained depths of complexity, subtlety, and sometimes danger. But with patience, observation, and understanding, truth would always emerge from the shadows. The days following Mr. Carstairs' arrest were unusually quiet in St. Mary Mead. The initial shock of revelation had given way to a subdued rhythm, where villagers moved with careful deliberation, still processing the recent events. Even the shops and cottages, usually abuzz with casual chatter, carried a hushed atmosphere. It was as though the village collectively held its breath, aware that beneath the seeming calm, subtle tensions lingered. Miss Marple walked through the village that morning, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders against the crisp winter air. Each step left a delicate imprint in the fresh snow, a mirror of her careful, considered approach to life. As she passed the bakery, She noted Mrs. Pettigrew arranging mince pies in the window with exaggerated precision, her hands shaking slightly despite her determined facade. The older woman caught Miss Marple's gaze and offered a tentative smile, as if acknowledging a shared understanding. Life must continue, even amid residual unease. Lady Agatha Redfern had invited Miss Marple to her estate for tea once more, a gesture of gratitude mingled with lingering anxiety. The grand drawing room, filled with seasonal decorations, reflected a carefully maintained order. Lady Agatha herself moved with meticulous grace, adjusting ornaments and straightening the silverware before settling into her chair. She glanced at Miss Marple, her eyes betraying the faintest trace of vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. "I must confess, Miss Marple," Lady Agatha began, voice carefully measured, "the entire ordeal has shaken me more than I anticipated, and yet I cannot help but marvel at how you unraveled the mystery with such quiet precision." Miss Marple sipped her tea gently, savoring the warmth. "It is rarely the loud declarations or dramatic gestures that reveal the truth, Lady Agatha. It is the small details, the gestures, the hesitations, the inconsistencies that illuminate human nature." Lady Agatha's fingers trembled slightly as she held her cup. "Yes, I suppose. I had always believed myself to be perceptive. Yet I see now how easily one can be misled. Even those we trust, or believe we understand, can conceal intentions beneath the most ordinary expressions." Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly so, and this is why observation and patience are paramount. Human nature is rarely simple, and appearances are often deceptive." The conversation shifted naturally to the villagers themselves. Lady Agatha spoke of Reverend Hargreaves's quiet relief, noting the subtle ways in which he now moved among parishioners with a gentler, more attentive demeanor. The vicar had learned, perhaps unconsciously, the value of careful observation and the importance of weighing actions against intentions. "Henry Barton," Lady Agatha continued, a faint smile breaking through her composed exterior, "has taken quite an interest in observing others since the events unfolded. I dare say he will become quite adept, much like you, Miss Marple, though with far more youthful enthusiasm." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "Henry has an attentive mind, with guidance. He may indeed learn the subtle arts of observation, which, when tempered by patience and empathy, reveal the truth far more effectively than force or assumption." They spoke briefly of Mrs. Pettigrew, whose continued dramatization of the events brought a curious mixture of amusement and exasperation to those around her. Yet even her exaggerations contained truths, however distorted, and she now seemed to recognize, at least subconsciously, the quiet authority of Miss Marple's methods. The discussion then turned to the broader implications of the case. Lady Agatha sighed softly. "I suppose we must all reflect on how small grievances, minor resentments, and hidden frustrations can culminate in such unexpected consequences." "It is a sobering thought." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, the seeds of misjudgment often lie buried in the everyday interactions we take for granted. When combined with opportunity and impulse, they may lead to outcomes none of us could have predicted. The case is a reminder that human behavior, though often predictable in patterns, can still surprise us in its intensity and subtlety." Lady Agatha's eyes softened as she regarded Miss Marple. "And yet, through it all, you have provided clarity, revealing not only the culprit, but the delicate balance of human nature in our village. I am grateful, not merely for the resolution of the crime, but for the insight you have offered." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, her voice calm. "Gratitude is unnecessary. Observation, reflection, and understanding are rewards in themselves. To see human nature clearly is a continual lesson." and St. Mary Mead has offered a particularly rich one in recent weeks. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple took her leave, walking slowly through the village once more. The streets, softened by snow, carried a quiet beauty that contrasted with the recent turmoil. Shops were closing for the evening, and the faint light of candlelit windows suggested warmth and safety within. Yet beneath the surface, she knew, human nature remained intricate and unpredictable, a constant interplay of pride, fear, desire, and conscience. Passing the vicarage, she observed Reverend Hargreaves speaking with parishioners, offering guidance with a renewed patience and attentiveness. Henry Barton lingered nearby, his keen eyes observing subtle gestures and expressions, silently practicing the skills Miss Marple had so gently encouraged. Mrs. Pettigrew, in her own animated way, continued her storytelling, though now tempered by an underlying recognition of truth and observation. Miss Marple paused for a moment, gazing at the snow-covered rooftops. The village was restored to an appearance of normalcy, but she understood that beneath the quiet exterior, life remained layered with complexities, hidden motives, and subtle interactions. The case had reminded her once again that even in the most tranquil settings, human nature could conceal shadows and reveal truths, only to those patient enough to notice. Returning to her cottage, she settled into her favorite chair by the fire. The cat leapt onto her lap, curling contentedly as she stroked its fur. Tea warmed her hands, and the soft crackle of the hearth offered a comforting rhythm. In the stillness, she reflected on the events of the past weeks, the careful orchestration of deceit, the small clues left behind, the gestures that spoke volumes, and the lessons about human nature that each villager had unwittingly provided. It was a lesson she knew would remain relevant. In St. Mary Mead, as in any community, appearances could deceive, words could mislead, and intentions could remain hidden. Yet with patience, empathy, and careful observation, the truth could always be uncovered, often quietly, without fanfare, and with lasting impact. As night fell and the snow continued to drift softly over the village, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented smile. St. Mary Mead would endure, its secrets partially revealed, its lessons quietly absorbed, and she, as always, would remain vigilant, patient, and observant, ready for the next puzzle that human nature might present. For in the gentle rhythms of village life, even amidst the quiet of winter, mysteries persisted, and Miss Marple, serene and perceptive, was always prepared to discern them, unravel them, and restore clarity with subtle yet unerring precision. The first pale light of Christmas morning filtered through the frosted windows of St. Mary Mead, illuminating the village with a gentle glow. The streets were blanketed in soft snow, pristine and unbroken, as if the world itself sought to offer peace after the recent turbulence. The events surrounding Mr. Albright's murder, the cryptic notes, and the careful unraveling of Mr. Carstairs' deception had left an indelible mark on the village. Yet life had begun its steady return to normalcy. Miss Marple walked slowly along the familiar paths, her shawl drawn snugly around her shoulders. Each footprint she left in the snow was solitary and deliberate, a mirror of her thoughtful approach to life and observation. The village, now outwardly calm, carried the quiet residue of tension, the subtle, unspoken acknowledgement of the secrets and misdeeds that had briefly disrupted the peace. Yet there was also relief, a sense that the truth had been revealed and justice served. The vicarage was alive with the subdued activity of preparations for the Christmas service. Reverend Hargreaves moved among parishioners with quiet assurance, his composure steadier than it had been in recent weeks. The case had deepened his understanding of human nature, teaching him that beneath appearances, individuals often concealed motivations and emotions that required careful observation to discern. The vicar, once purely concerned with external order, now approached his pastoral duties with a subtle attentiveness born of recent experience. Henry Barton, his curiosity undiminished, lingered near the edge of the vicarage courtyard. His young eyes scanned the small details of movement and behavior with renewed attentiveness, a nascent detective's instinct beginning to flourish. Miss Marple, noticing his subtle observations, allowed herself a quiet smile. The boy had learned, even without formal instruction, the value of noticing what others overlooked, and the skill would serve him well in years to come. Mrs. Pettigrew, as ever, moved with a flourish, recounting episodes from the investigation with animated gestures. Her theatrical nature had been softened slightly by the gravity of events. She now spoke with the awareness that observation and truth were more enduring than rumor and exaggeration. Even her dramatic inclinations served, in a sense, as a reminder to the villagers that human nature was never simple, and that every story held layers beneath its surface. Lady Agatha Redfern's estate had regained its orderly appearance, though she moved through the rooms with a heightened sense of awareness. The ordeal had reminded her that appearances could deceive, and that trust must be both measured and cautious. Miss Marple had provided clarity not only in revealing the culprit, but also in illuminating the subtle interplay of character, motive, and circumstance that governed the village. Lady Agatha, reflecting on the lessons learned, felt a measure of humility alongside her relief. Miss Marple herself, returning to her cozy cottage at the edge of the village, settled into her favorite chair by the fire. The cat curled comfortably on her lap, purring softly. She gazed into the flames, reflecting upon the recent events with calm satisfaction. The case had confirmed once more the enduring principles she had long observed. Human behavior reveals truth more reliably than physical evidence alone. Subtle observation is often more powerful than direct inquiry.
And even the cleverest manipulations leave discernible traces. The cryptic notes,
The flower smudges, the carefully staged knife, and the misleading gestures, all had been designed to deceive, to manipulate the perceptions of those around the murderer. Yet each act of misdirection had carried the seeds of its own revelation. Human nature, with all its pride, fear, and desire, had provided the threads that allowed Miss Marple to unravel the plot. Outside, the village stirred as families prepared for Christmas celebrations. Smoke rose gently from chimneys, mingling with the crisp winter air. Children laughed as they played in the snow, their joy unburdened by the recent darkness. Villagers exchanged greetings, tentative yet sincere, their interactions now tempered by the awareness of how quickly trust and suspicion could intertwine. Life, in its ordinary rhythms, had resumed, though subtly reshaped by the events of the past weeks. Miss Marple reflected on the enduring complexity of human nature. Even in a tranquil village such as St. Mary Mead, pride, jealousy, ambition, and fear could lead to consequences far beyond what casual observers might predict. Yet equally, patience, attentiveness, and understanding offered the means to discern truth, to mediate justice, and to restore balance. The case had been solved not by force or accusation, but by quiet observation, thoughtful inference, and a profound knowledge of the human heart. She thought again of Mr. Carstairs, now in custody, awaiting trial. His cleverness had been considerable, yet insufficient to outwit careful observation. His actions had been revealed not by his outward demeanor, which was meticulously composed, but by the subtleties of gesture, hesitation, and unconscious expression. Even deliberate attempts at misdirection, crafted with intelligence and patience, ultimately failed against insight, grounded in empathy and understanding. As dusk approached, Miss Marple prepared her small Christmas tea, the warmth of the fire and the aroma of fresh biscuits providing a gentle comfort. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, appreciating the village in its winter tranquility. Each home, each street, each small interaction contained stories, some visible, some concealed, all shaped by the complexity of human nature. She considered, too, the lessons that the villagers would carry forward. Suspicion, when unchecked, could lead to unnecessary fear. Trust, when unexamined, could invite deception. Yet careful observation, tempered by empathy, could illuminate the truth. In St. Mary Mead, these lessons would quietly shape future interactions. Even as ordinary life resumed, the cat stretched, purring louder, and Miss Marple smiled softly, acknowledging the small, enduring comforts of home. She reflected on her role, not as a solver of crimes for glory, but as a patient observer of human nature, ready to unravel puzzles, quiet and unassuming, when the need arose. Outside, the snow continued to drift down silently, coating the village in a peaceful blanket of white. Inside, Miss Marple's cottage glowed warmly, a sanctuary of calm observation and thoughtful reflection. The mysteries of human nature, she mused, would continue, as intricate and unpredictable as ever. Yet in her quiet vigilance, she remained prepared to discern, untangle, and illuminate, revealing the truths hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life. And so, St. Mary Mead returned to its gentle rhythm, carrying with it lessons learned, hearts eased, and the comforting knowledge that even amidst quiet streets and ordinary facades, clarity and understanding could prevail. For Miss Marple, peace was never passive. It was the careful observation of life's subtleties, the patience to perceive the unseen, and the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed. The Christmas bells tolled softly in the distance, a melodic reminder that life continued, mysteries persisted, and the village endured, ever watched over by its gentle yet perceptive guardian.